This is an introductory lecture on the fundamentals of natural resource management. It's going to focus on terrestrial natural resources, but it is important to remember that natural resources obviously include marine and aquatic natural resources as well. Another important thing to remember is that this is really my perspective of the elements that I think are fundamental to natural resource management. If you talk to almost any management professional or academic, they would probably have a different perspective on what things are important. But the things that I think are important include being able to define and describe natural resources and the types of natural resources and how they're managed, to talk about the constraints and planning that are necessary when we think about how to manage natural resources. I also think it's really important to understand the history of natural resource management and how that influences the context of what we do when we're managing natural resources. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the expertise needed for careers in natural resource management. It can be helpful to start with a definition. So one definition of natural resources are resources that exist without the actions of humans. So these are resources that would be there whether we're there playing a part or not. So that's one definition of natural resources. Now there are two main classes of natural resources: renewable and non-renewable. So renewable natural resources are resources that in most cases are available in perpetuity. So they potentially could last forever. And we could use them again and again, and they're renewable. So things like forests, solar energy, water, and so on, those are all renewable natural resources. And then obviously the contrast to that is non-renewable. These are resources that once we use them, they're not available for our use again. Now, technically, for instance, a very typical non-renewable resource would be fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels are renewed. They're sort of always being produced out of organic remains of mainly plants and animals deep in the Earth's crust. But the rate of that renewal is so slow relative to our use of those resources that they are not being replaced. So those resources are non-renewable. All right, so that's the definition of natural resources. So what is the definition of natural resource management? Again, this varies, but this is my definition. It's the planned manipulation or lack of manipulation. Sometimes we may choose not to manipulate. Of ecosystem composition, structure, and function. Sorry about my handwriting. To achieve desired objectives. Okay, so I'd used a couple of terms here. Composition. Composition usually refers to which species or in an ecosystem. So often our management is designed in a way to influence what species are or are not on a particular site, for instance. Structure refers to the spatial arrangement of usually plants in that ecosystem. So you could think about things like tree spacing or the distribution of layers of vegetation in an ecosystem. Those can be manipulated in different ways. And then finally, function. There are different ways we can manipulate function, but some of the most common or obvious ones are manipulation of disturbance regimes, especially, for instance, fire frequency or intensity. We may manipulate those things in an ecosystem as well. Okay, so that's my definition of natural resource management. And then the fundamental tenet. So what's sort of the most important rule of natural resource management? And that most important rule is that the landowner, not the manager, determines what the objectives are for that ecosystem or for that management. As a manager, we certainly most likely have opinions about what might be best for a particular situation. We may have a particular outcome in mind when we first see a piece of property, for instance. But generally, that's not our job as managers. Our job is to talk with the landowner or to understand the landowner's objectives, and then to create a plan that will enable that piece of property to achieve those objectives. Sometimes this is really straightforward. The landowner, you can talk to them directly and sometimes with a little help determine what their objectives are for a piece of property. Other times it may not be straightforward. So if you're the manager for a national forest, what is the landowner? Well, first, who is the landowner? That's a public agency that owns the national forests, and you can't talk to every citizen of the United States. Who is the landowner of that national forest? So for some, especially publicly owned natural resources, that determination of objectives is a whole thing by itself. But all of that being said, it's important to remember that as a manager, you are not the one that determines the objectives. It is your job to determine how to meet those objectives. So as an exercise, you might think about what might be some examples of natural resource objectives. Just as a heads up, it's a pretty long list. There are many, many different kinds of natural resource management objectives. Some of them might be really straightforward. Some of the most straightforward ones are objectives that involve the production of products from a natural resource. So for instance, the production of wood is a management objective, and that's fairly straightforward. The production of maple syrup from a sugar maple forest is another example of a management objectives. But management objectives can include things like watershed protection, carbon sequestration, aesthetics, demonstration or education, provision of wildlife habitat, rural development, soil stabilization. Sometimes there might be spiritual or religious objectives for a particular piece of property windbreaks, the list goes on and on. So natural resource management objectives are manifold. There's many types of landowners, but usually we can chunk those out into two broad areas: public landowners and private landowners. Now that's not as simple as it seems, because each of those categories can have many different subcategories. So for instance, public landowners might in the United States might include federal landowners, so things associated with the federal government, state landowners, municipal, cities and towns, county. All right, those are all different types of public land ownerships. And within each of those categories, for instance, there are many different types of federal landowners. Private, also, there are a number of different categories. So individuals, for instance, can be private landowners. It can be corporate landowners. You can have non-governmental private, or NGO landowners. So private can also have many different categories, and we have a completely separate lecture on different categories of, in this case, forest landowners that might be encountered. Another categorization that can be useful to think about, but is probably a little oversimplified, are the differences between conservation and preservation. Now, these two words also can have many different definitions, but these are National Park Service definitions, where conservation is the proper use of nature. Okay, so it involves use, whereas preservation is the protection of nature from consumptive use. So conservation usually involves consumptive use. So we might even say, proper consumptive use of nature. And by consumptive use, I mean that's a use that takes something away from the ecosystem. So hunting, the killing of animals, is a consumptive use of nature. Timber harvest is a consumptive use of nature. The consumptive doesn't mean that that type of management is not sustainable or is non-renewable. It just means that part of that use means we're getting a product or something from that ecosystem. Whereas preservation usually doesn't involve consumptive use. It means a protection from that. These pictures show these are both people talking to Teddy Roosevelt. And maybe one of these arrows is a little misleading. This is Teddy Roosevelt right here, but he's talking with John Muir, who's standing here. John Muir is a historical proponent of preservation management. So you can think of John Muir as sort of the intellectual precursor to the U.S. Park Service, the national parks. Whereas Gifford Pinchot is standing here talking about something tall with Teddy Roosevelt also. And Gifford Pinchot was an early proponent of conservation as a management approach for natural resources. So two very important early thinkers in natural resource management, one of them leaning towards preservation, one of them leading towards conservation.